I don't know if you've ever felt this way before when you're doing your work in the area of DE&I and feeling that it's a constant uphill battle. There's so much to achieve, so little time. And I think many of us will resonate with that image. So what I want to talk to you about today, just a little roadmap for the next half an hour or so, is first of all, is to talk about some of the threats, some of the psychology behind people feeling threatened by DE&I initiatives. Then we will talk about some case studies of organizations that I've worked with where they've chosen to take an approach where they've, whether it's been a keynote or a whole program that's had a foundation in empathy and some of the results from that. And then we will look at the value of looking at this alongside communication. I know we talked about, some of the speakers spoke about empowerment and how it's so important for individuals to feel empowered around this work. And I feel that giving people some communication tools to discuss D&I, to be able to not necessarily push back, but to listen and have that active listening when people are being resistant, those tools are really powerful. So I want to discuss those with you as well. So where does resistance come from? And when Sarah approached me to deliver this talk, I often deal with resistance when I'm talking about empathy, but I thought, well, let's formalize some of these different types of resistance that we face. So this is from an article in Harvard Business Review, and the authors said that they found that there were three main kinds of psychological threat that fuel resistance. So the first one you can see is status threat. So this idea that DEI is a zero-sum game. So if there's more resources going to one group, it means I get less. And so the pushback that those individuals have is they try and defend the status quo. We don't need change. Everything is fine just as it is. So the solution here is, of course, we talk about the business case a lot, but then also emphasizing that the policies that we are bringing into play are beneficial to everybody, not just those from underrepresented groups. The second threat is what we call merit threat. And this is where people say, well, I work hard. What are you saying? Are you saying that my work is that I'm biased and that the work that I've done shouldn't be recognized? So people are feeling a pushback when they're told that they have privilege. So here, what we can do is use self-affirmation exercises to boost people's self-esteem. And then it reduces this idea that there's a threat. And we often say you cannot pour from an empty cup. So if you tell these individuals, well, look how well you're doing, you sort of not butter them up, but basically get them to recognize what they have, what they've achieved, then they feel that their cup is full and they're more likely to be generous towards others. The third kind of threat is what we call the moral threat. And this is where if people say they acknowledge that they have privilege, they are themselves linking themselves to a system of unfairness or systemic bias. And they feel that that will tarnish their image. So what they do is they separate themselves from this and say, well, I don't have any bias at all. I've never experienced privilege. And so a solution to this is to suggest that DEI is a way for everyone to express their ideals. So if you have an ideal around equality, fairness, and so on, that DEI is a way for you to express that. So I want to share now a couple of case studies regarding empathy and some of the organizations that I've worked with. And many of you will have come across this Kubler-Ross change curve, where people go through a variety of different moods and emotions when faced with change. And as we know, DEI implementations are effectively change management, right? They require change management. So it's not unreasonable to expect that people will go through these different feelings, these emotions when faced with change. Also, interestingly, when managers are empathetic, and this is data from Catalyst, staff feel more included. And that's not only the individuals from underrepresented groups, but all staff feel more included. Again, a way to reduce pushback. So the benefits of an empathetic approach are manifold, right? So first of all, it's valuable to all employees. And I've had so many organizations come to me, even if it's for the DE&I summit, and they've said, well, we're experiencing pushback. We want to have a talk or a program that's beneficial to everybody. And they've chosen empathy as the way forward. It impacts both work and home life. And I've had organizations where we've had senior leaders go home after an empathy session. They find that they've got better relationships with their spouse, with their children. And again, that's opened them up to the power of this work. Also, it values understanding, it values openness, it promotes curiosity, courage, and taking action, and helps us to overcome, of course, resistance. So let's look at a few case studies now. And at the end of this session, I will give you an opportunity to download a white paper where we spoke with 15 different leaders from DE&I and HR across the world, and they shared their own thoughts and the way that they've put together, for example, business cases around empathy, the way they've used listening sessions and other empathetic tools to further their goals within the organization for DE&I. So as I mentioned, quite a few organizations will come and they will say, well, we have a DE&I program, but we need something to bring people together. And so sometimes that's at the beginning of the program. So they might have a session on empathy in the workplace and then back that up with the typical curriculum on areas like bias and inclusion and so on. Sometimes they've already got a program underway and they feel that they need an intervention where they, again, create an empathetic environment for the employees. Now, the first case study I want to share with you is an international consulting company, and they have staff in Asia, primarily in the UK, and then some in America. And they wanted to implement a DE&I program, but they were finding a lot of pushback, mainly in the areas of status threat, where people were saying, well, look, we're perfect as we are, we're a successful organization, why on earth do we need to change things? And then also merit threats, where people were saying, well, we don't see any sort of systemic inequality in the UK. And of course there is, but a lot of these individuals are white middle-class individuals, and it was something that they weren't aware of. And so what this organization did is, after bringing in a consultant to really give them a roadmap, they decided that they would take an empathetic approach, start with I think it's a 2 or 3 hour long session on empathy at one of their retreats, and then go from there. And I was speaking to the DE&I lead a couple of weeks ago, and she was saying that a year later, some of the changes include consultants at this organization who are now self-disclosing freely. They're sharing that perhaps they have ADHD, or that they have some ethnicity that they hadn't revealed before. So they're being much more open and honest. They've started a podcast to share their stories. They're embracing DE&I, and they really felt that this idea of a soft approach, but also challenging, made people more open. They weren't defensive. And so now inclusion is front and center in all that they do. And interestingly, the session that we did on bias, when I asked the group what was the most interesting to them, they were saying, well, learning about white privilege, white tears, all those sorts of things were now really interesting to them, and useful tools, as opposed to wanting to push back. This doesn't exist. So this was quite a useful case study on the power of empathy. So what I also want to talk about are communication tools. As I mentioned at the beginning, the work that I do is around emotional intelligence, DE&I, and also the communication, because all too often it's very easy for us to say, well, this is what should be done, this is where we're going, but we don't give people those tools on the ground to just have those interactions with each other that will get everybody moving in the same direction. So some of the communication tools that I typically share are tools to help people become more empathetic, or to display empathy better when they're in conversation. And then also a couple of tools that have gone down very well over the last couple of years are tools around calling out and calling in. But I'd love to hear from you. I've gone very, very quickly today, haven't had a lot of time, but of the areas that we talked about, what's most useful to you? Was it understanding the power of combining communication and emotional intelligence with this DE&I work? Or was it looking at those different psychological threats? Or was it understanding how powerful empathy can be to break down resistance? Or was it just hearing those brief case studies? Or was it using calling in as a tool to overcome resistance? Or perhaps even the idea of advocates and educators and how advocates can sometimes do damage. They're fantastic, we need them, but sometimes we need to step them out of the way and have educators interact with those individuals who are experiencing resistance.